I'm writing to you because I need to get this off my chest before it consumes every last bit of my sanity. I hope you can understand where I'm coming from. I live in Phoenix, and I've always considered myself a pretty standard camper. Definitely not a rookie, but not some hardened wilderness guru either. Anyway, this happened on a trip up to the Grand Canyon National Park around mid-October of last year. You know how it's still warm during the day, even that late in the season, but the nights can drop surprisingly quickly into that biting chill. That chill was the least of my worries, though. I arrived at the Desert View campground on the South Rim. I'd been here a few times before, and it never fails to amaze me. The first day was typical: bustling tourists, lined up RVs, families taking selfies at scenic overlooks. Just the usual. But the second night, that's when things took a turn. I remember I was just sitting by my fire, poking at the embers and thinking about how the earliest explorers once believed the canyon held hidden passages to lost civilizations. I'd read some old story about a secret Egyptian tomb rumored to have been discovered in the early 1900s by an explorer named Kincaid. Some folks say it's a hoax, others swear the Smithsonian covered it up. I started wondering if there was any truth to all that, if maybe the government hid it for some obscure reason. My mind was swirling with those thoughts when I heard the first sound, like a low moan, but not quite human. It was distant, echoing off the rock walls, so faint it almost disappeared into the wind. At first, I chalked it up to the canyon itself. Those walls can play tricks on your ears, especially after sunset. But the noise came again, only a few minutes later. This time it was closer, more hungry, if that makes sense. I tried to ignore it and turned my attention back to the fire. I must have spent an hour just staring at the flames, thinking about the illusions out here in the desert, the swirling vortexes of Sedona, the rumored hidden bases near the canyon where some say the military conducts top-secret experiments. You hear these stories on late-night radio shows, stuff about interdimensional beings slipping in and out of our world, especially around remote areas. And I swear, that's when I started feeling it, a presence that kept me on edge, like someone or something was gliding between the pines just beyond my line of sight. I finally got up to do a perimeter check around my campsite. You know how it is. You have that paranoid moment. Did I attract a predator with my dinner scraps? Did I leave food out that might bring in coyotes or something? But there was nothing. The area was eerily silent, save for some rustling in the brush. The moon was bright enough that I could see the shapes of trees and boulders. And then it happened. I caught a glimpse of movement, a tall shape, unnaturally thin, stepping just behind a juniper. When I say tall, I mean it towered in a way that no human silhouette should. And though it was mostly hidden by the shadow, I could see something like an antler or twisted horn protruding from its head. My heart nearly exploded. I must have stood there for a good few minutes, wanting to dismiss what I saw as a trick of the moonlight. I managed to convince myself to return to my campsite, gather my thoughts, maybe steel myself enough to investigate more thoroughly. But I couldn't shake the dread. It's like the night itself turned thick and heavy. Finally, I crawled into my camper, locked it up tight, and tried to calm down. I woke around 2 a.m. to scratching sounds, not violent, but deliberate. My immediate thought was that it could be the wind brushing a tree branch against the side, but we both know that's the excuse you use when you don't want to face the reality of something unnatural. I tried to hold my breath, straining to hear anything else. Then came a peculiar clicking noise. It reminded me of a cross between an insect's chirp and an attempt at human speech, but it didn't belong in this world. Every hair on my body stood on end. Back in Phoenix, I'd read about the Wendigo from up north, an Algonquian legend typically associated with frigid climates, cannibalism, and dark, ravenous spirits. It never occurred to me that anything like that would ever lurk in the desert. But in that moment, with the primal fear pulsing through me, that's exactly what popped into my head. I wondered if these legends can manifest anywhere desperation or a certain malevolence thrives. Then came the stench. My God, that stench. It was like rotting meat combined with decaying leaves. It overwhelmed every sense, and I nearly gagged. The next thing I recall is hearing what must have been my own voice in a strangled sort of whimper as I tried to keep quiet. I also remember distinctly thinking about the conspiracy swirling around the Grand Canyon, the rumored lost city hidden somewhere beneath the rocky crags, the bizarre sightings of reptilian creatures near certain caves. My mind was running wild. What if the government does know about something that resides here? Something that defies classification, and they keep it all quiet to preserve the park's image? The scratching and clicking died down after what felt like forever, but might have only been 10 or 15 minutes. When I finally emerged from my camper at dawn, heart pounding, hand trembling around a flashlight, I half expected to see blood, footprints, or some sign of savage intrusion. But there was nothing except a series of faint, elongated impressions in the dirt. They didn't look like any prints I've seen. I've spent time in northern Arizona, southwestern deserts, you name it. I've seen coyote tracks, javelina tracks, random scuttles from lizards. These were different, like splayed-out handprints, but distorted, elongated fingers. I can't even say for certain they were tracks, but they definitely didn't look human. I felt disoriented and irrationally angry at the silence around me, as if the canyon was mocking my terror. I thought about packing up and leaving immediately. Yet a strange curiosity rooted me there until mid-morning, convincing me to scope the grounds for other clues. People around the campground seemed normal, going about their day, unsuspecting. At one point, I overheard a ranger telling someone to stay on marked trails, but her tone was odd, almost like an unspoken warning. I kept my mouth shut. I mean, how do you casually mention to a park ranger you think a Wendigo or some spirit is skulking around? Finally, when I got on the road heading back to Phoenix, I kept replaying everything in my head, wondering if it was all some delirious nightmare. But even a nightmare wouldn't explain those marks in the dirt, nor would it explain why I've had an uneasy feeling ever since, as if something followed me home. Waiting, watching. There's a sense of being observed at odd hours, a chill that creeps across the living room in the middle of the night. Maybe it's just leftover paranoia, but it's intense enough that I needed to reach out to you. I apologize if this comes off as rambling. It's been gnawing at me for months, and the more I tried to make sense of it, the more tangled my thoughts became. I can't talk to anyone else about this, not seriously. Friends laugh it off or offer some rational explanation about coyotes or dehydration. Whatever I encountered up there wasn't simply an animal or a typical cryptid. It felt ancient, cursed, as though it carried centuries of darkness on its back. Some might call it a Wendigo. Others might say it's a shapeshifter or something else entirely. I don't know. All I know is I never want to see it again. Welcome to Weird Encounters, a place where the ordinary fades into shadow and the unexplainable comes alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and become part of our ever-growing community of the curious. Now prepare yourself, because what you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. They say the woods can be peaceful, quiet, serene, even comforting if you're lucky. But what happens when that tranquility turns sour, when branches creak in the darkness, sounding more like beckoning fingers than swaying limbs, and an innocent hunting trip morphs into something else entirely? The following account, shared in the hope of shedding light on the strange and unsettling, might just make you think twice before wandering too far into the night. I've been a hunter in Arizona for most of my life. I'm no stranger to the hush of the forest at dawn or the booming echo of my rifle across the pines. Usually, that quiet is a comfort, but something happened last month in Coconino National Forest that I just can't shake. It was the weekend following that big storm we had in late August. You remember how the monsoon rolled in over Flagstaff and caused some minor flooding along Route 66? I'd planned a short hunting trip near the southern edge of the forest, off one of those lesser-known fire roads, somewhere between Munns Park and Mormon Lake. I don't even recall the exact forest road number, might have been FR 240, but they all start blending together if you've been out there as much as I have. I was set up near a ridge where deer are commonly spotted early in the morning. Nothing fancy, just me, my rifle, and a battered old trail camera that I like to use for capturing wildlife footage. The day passed quietly, the only highlight being a near miss on a decent-sized buck in the late afternoon. So by the time dusk settled in, I was thinking about packing it in. That's when I heard the first howl. At first, I thought it could be coyotes. Lord knows they can sound pretty eerie. But this was deeper. It carried a resonance that made my stomach knot, like it was echoing from somewhere deeper than the throat of any canine I've heard. I set my gear down and pulled out my phone to record, just in case. I've got a few buddies who run a small cryptid discussion group, unofficially, of course, and I figured they might get a kick out of unidentified howls. But the more I listened, the less I felt like it was just some random wild animal. The calls had an almost anguished quality, like they were infused with human-like distress or fury. I remember that sudden chill rolling down my spine as the howls faded. I'm not saying the temperature dropped or anything. It was more an internal cold, like an instinctive warning. I started thinking about all the stories I'd heard from locals. Even some whispered by older folks who claim Navajo blood, tales of skinwalkers, shapeshifters said to prowl remote corners of the Southwest. They usually revolve around the Four Corners area or the Navajo Nation, not so much around Coconino. Still, the desert nights can hide anything. I tried to shrug it off, double-checking my surroundings. The pines were thick, and occasionally a gust of wind would send the smell of damp earth swirling around me. You know how strong the scent of pine can be when everything's wet. Then, out of nowhere, something bolted across my peripheral vision, too tall for a coyote, too fast for a human. It was just a flicker of a shape between the trees. But I swear, it moved almost like a man on all fours, then half rose, then disappeared again. My heart pounded against my rib cage so hard, I was sure it would spook every creature in a mile radius. I found my head spinning with random thoughts. My mind jumped to the stories about secret government test sites near the Mogollon Rim, half-baked rumors that they're messing with genetic experiments or advanced camouflage suits. Seems far-fetched, but in that moment, I'd have believed just about any conspiracy theory to explain what I'd witnessed. Could it be a feral person? A soldier gone AWOL from some covert facility? Or maybe it was nothing more than a big elk in poor light. But no. The shape was too angular, too wrong. I decided to hunker down behind a large ponderosa, phone in one hand, rifle in the other, just listening. That's when the howls started up again, but this time from multiple directions. It felt like a twisted call and response routine. One would sound off to my left, long, moaning, and guttural, followed by another from somewhere behind me. My phone mic was picking it up, but the recording sounded muffled, probably because I was shaking so badly, trying to keep quiet. At one point, I managed to glance at my watch, close to midnight by then. I should have been back in Flagstaff, warm in a motel bed, or at least camped near a more populated area. But I couldn't bring myself to move. Each time I thought about starting my truck, I got the uneasy feeling that stepping out of my cover would be a monumental mistake. That's when I smelled it. An odor that reminded me of roadkill left out in the sun, only sharper, like stale blood with a chemical edge. It's tough to put into words, but my stomach lurched, and I had to swallow hard to keep from gagging. I flashed back to a conversation I'd had years ago with a friend who claims he encountered a skinwalker near Tuba City. He mentioned a stench that made him physically ill, and how something about it felt unnatural, like a presence that defied logic. Could that really be happening to me now? I could almost hear his voice in my head telling me, when you smell it, it's already too late. If I'm being honest, I spent the next few hours just on edge, picking up faint movement in the corners of my vision. The forest was alive, but not in the usual way. There were no crickets chirping, no owls hooting, just the sporadic rustle of underbrush and the occasional crack of a branch. I kept thinking about how the Hopi, the Zuni, various tribes, they all have legends, often with similar threads about spirits or beings that can take on forms to deceive. The Navajo call them skinwalkers, witches that can don animal skins and shapeshift at will. I never imagined I'd be worrying about that lore in the middle of a hunting trip, but there I was. By around 4 a.m., everything died down. As first light crept through the treetops, I finally mustered the courage to inch my way to my truck. The forest felt like it was holding its breath. I started the engine, half expecting something to lunge at my window, but nothing happened. The drive back to civilization was a blur, with the sunrise painting the sky pink and orange, a stark contrast to the dread still coiling in my gut. I listened to the audio I'd captured once I got home. Chills ran through me all over again. The howl sounded almost human, like a person wailing in pain and anger, but layered with a resonance too deep for any normal vocal cords. I sent a clip to one of my buddies in that cryptid group, and he was dumbfounded, said he'd never heard anything quite like it. Part of me wants to share it widely, see if maybe a wildlife expert can ID it, but a bigger part of me worries about what they might say, or if somehow I'll draw attention from something I shouldn't. I haven't told many people about this, and the few who know think I'm either sleep-deprived or spooking myself with old legends. But the memory of that night lingers. Sometimes I'll be out walking in the early evening in my own neighborhood, and a dog's bark will catch me off guard, sending my mind racing back to those howls. I'm not sure if skinwalkers are real, but I can't deny what I heard, what I smelled, and that fleeting shape I saw weaving through the pines. Maybe someone else has had a similar experience in the Coconino. Or maybe it's just another unsolved piece of the puzzle out here in the high desert. I still can't go out hunting without scanning the tree line and feeling that little spike of terror in my gut. It might fade over time, but then again, maybe not. Stay safe out there. There's a peculiar quiet that settles in the desert at night, beautiful in its own way, but also so vast and unyielding that a single strange light in the sky can tilt your world off balance. Take the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona, a place where ancient wood turned to stone becomes a silent chorus of eons past. But for one camper, it wasn't the fossilized remains that stole the show. It was the flicker of something high above, something that might defy any ordinary explanation. First of all, let me say this is the only place I can think to send my experience without being called outright crazy. I'm usually pretty grounded. I've been traveling around Arizona for years, checking out the unique geology and camping whenever I can find a spot off the beaten path. But late last month, I decided to camp near the Petrified Forest National Park, out by the Painted Desert area, specifically on the north side not far from the Painted Desert Visitor Center. The idea was to capture some night sky photography because they say the stargazing is incredible out there, far from city lights. I got in on a Friday evening, May 19th, 2024 if memory serves, had my little campsite set up. Nothing fancy. Just me, my tent, a fold-out chair, and a cheap radio that only managed to pick up a faint station out of Holbrook. The stars were coming in bright, and I remember feeling that sense of awe, like you do when you look up at a clear desert sky. Around 11 p.m., that's when I noticed the lights. At first, just a single orb drifting overhead, strangely silent. Then two more appeared, forming a sort of triangular pattern. They weren't blinking like commercial airplanes, and they moved with an almost unnatural smoothness, No sound, no sonic boom, nothing. I grabbed my phone, tried to record, but it was too dark and the camera picked up only blackness with a few shaky specks. By now, my heart was in my throat. I recalled hearing about UFO sightings in northern Arizona, but I'd always dismissed them as misidentifications of satellites or maybe military planes out of Luke Air Force Base. This was different. These lights would hover, then zip to another position in the sky in the span of a breath. It looked purposeful, like something scanning the area. Sometime around midnight, I saw a faint beam shoot down from one of the lights, illuminating a patch of desert, then vanish. I swear, I felt the hair on my arm stand on end, like there was an electrical charge in the air. Part of me wanted to jump in my car and drive until I hit the nearest gas station, but I couldn't move, couldn't look away. Another beam flickered on and off in a different spot, farther out near some of the petrified logs. The orbs regrouped, then simply shot off in unison toward the horizon, disappearing in a split second. I stayed up half the night, too wired to sleep. I kept replaying the sight in my mind, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was some advanced drone technology, or a group of them. Then my mind drifted to the hush-hush rumors you hear every so often. Government programs testing next-gen aircraft in remote desert areas, stealth technology that baffles the senses. You wouldn't think the petrified forest would be a prime testing ground, but who knows? The next morning, I was at the Painted Desert Visitor Center, hoping maybe someone else saw the same thing. I overheard a couple of folks talking about lights they'd spotted from their RV sites. One lady said it looked like a triangular ship, and a guy mentioned he thought it was an experimental plane. Another older man quietly suggested it might be something out of Area 51 or the White Sands Missile Range that had drifted too far north. Everyone seemed on edge, uneasy, like they wanted more answers, but also didn't want to stir any trouble. That's when things took a weird turn. I got approached by two men wearing black suits. Yes, the cliché men in black ensemble. One had dark sunglasses, even though we were indoors, and the other didn't. Neither wore name tags or had any agency logos. They just walked up calmly and mentioned they'd heard I'd been asking questions about the unusual light activity last night. They didn't introduce themselves, but they had an air of authority that rattled my nerves. I felt cornered in that visitor center hallway, and I remember fumbling my water bottle as they stared me down. They implied it'd be best if I didn't go sharing unsubstantiated rumors. They stressed that advanced aircraft exercises happen in Arizona more often than people realize, and that local news outlets sometimes blow stories out of proportion. I tried to explain that I only wanted to figure out what I'd seen, but they gave me a look I can only describe as a silent warning. Then they turned and walked away as abruptly as they'd arrived. I quickly got the sense from people milling around that these men in black had cornered a few other witnesses that morning as well. One woman quietly shared how they asked for her phone, demanded to see any footage. She was too scared to resist. Another guy, who apparently had some sort of high-end camera setup, said they told him his images were confiscated in the interest of national security. Everyone was rattled, whispering about government cover-ups, advanced technology, and how the desert might hide more secrets than we'll ever know. As the day wore on, I drove through parts of the park, picking up bits and pieces of more accounts from visitors and staff. Some folks said they saw an unmarked helicopter pass overhead around 2 a.m., scanning the area with a spotlight. Others woke to a bizarre hum that set their teeth on edge. A park ranger apparently shrugged it off, saying it was probably just a refueling run or a rescue chopper. But you could see in her eyes she wasn't entirely convinced by her own explanation. By the time I left the park that afternoon, I had too many questions and absolutely no answers. We've all heard the stories about big black trucks pulling up to UFO witnesses' homes, or men in dark suits intercepting them at the grocery store, telling them to keep quiet. I always chalked that up to lore, some modern boogeyman tale. Now, having met these men in black face to face, I'm not so sure. I keep thinking about those lights, the unnatural way they moved. I can't help but believe this is some high-level government tech, like stealth drones or advanced aircraft that can defy typical flight physics. Maybe they were running a test, and the last thing they want is a bunch of tourists posting videos online. But then I wonder, why so extreme? Why show up in person at a national park, basically intimidating random visitors who caught a glimpse? Anyway, that's the whole strange affair. I know I'm rambling here, but it's tough to recount without getting a bit flustered. My only hope is that someone else reading or watching your YouTube channel might step forward with a similar experience, or maybe some insider knowledge. I'm not trying to stir up trouble. I just need to make sense of what happened. The desert has always held its share of mysteries, but this one feels especially unnerving. Thanks for reading. I'm still not sure if I'll ever look up at a desert night sky the same way again. And so, another strange encounter fades away. A trick of the mind, or something far more unsettling. That's for you to decide. Thank you so much for watching my stories. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support is what keeps this channel going.